you all for participating tonight. We appreciate you coming virtually. And we'd like to thank Dr. Nino and Bob Jensen. And I also want to say thank you to the Roseville Library for their co-sponsorship and to the Maplewood Area Historical Society for their partnership with us. Please check our website at www.rchs.com for upcoming programs as they become available. And please also consider becoming a member if you aren't already. So a couple technical points for us tonight. Please keep your microphones muted, and questions may be typed in the chat box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We will read out the questions after the presentation, and Dr. Nino or Bob will answer those. The program will hopefully be recorded, if I did this correctly. And if so, it'll be available on the Ramsey County Historical Society's YouTube channel with a link on our website. And we will also hopefully make available the video that Dr. Nino will be premiering tonight. So again, those links will be on our website and hopefully on our Facebook in a few days. So it might not be up immediately, but hopefully really soon. So let me introduce our speakers for tonight. Dr. Jeremy Nino owns and operates Nino Cultural Consultants, LLC. Jeremy is a passionate cultural resource preservation liaison, consultant, and educator, actively pursuing new energies, technologies, and projects within local county organizations, higher education, and the professional heritage preservation community. Jeremy has taught at public and private higher education institutes throughout the Twin Cities. At Inver Hills Community College, he established the Anthropology Department and the program there. He is also the president of the Minnesota Council of Archaeology. Jeremy's current archaeological research has been focused on the early hinterlands of the Twin Cities metro area. And let me let in a couple more people.
I keep letting them in as they come in, Robin. You're doing great.
Bob Jensen is the past president of the Maplewood Area Historical Society, and he is the current treasurer. Bob is a historian, an amateur archaeologist, and has promoted surveys of archaeological sites in our area as part of our mission to collect and preserve Maplewood's history, even as far back as the last ice age. So again, thank you. I'm going to stop this. Thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nino right now. And again, if you have questions or comments, please type them in the chat box, and we will answer those after the presentation. So again, Dr. Jeremy Nino.
All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jeremy and Dr. Nino, as Robin said. Just a couple of quick points here. We will be asking everybody to stay muted during the presentation. It just there becomes too much feedback and everything as the presentation is going on. So please stay muted. And I would also ask if you to turn off your camera as well to save bandwidth. We get to see Chuck at the moment.
Yes.
Now there's two of them. There's Chuck and Linda. They're both there. So if people are turning off their camera, which is great, again, to stay on that bandwidth. So we're slowly getting there. Got some voices, but I'm sure those will stay muted. All right, so how tonight is going to work is I have been working with the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative, which is a group of 4 county historical societies, Dakota County, Scott County, Ramsey County, and Anoka County, over the last 6 years, developing and doing archaeology in the various, each of their various counties. There have been 3 different large grants that they have gone after. I've been lucky enough to work on 2 of those large projects with them. Another one of them was awarded to a different archaeological company to do some initial alpha sites work. But as part of this last round of work, we wanted to do a whole series of presentations about the public archaeology that we'd done. And we couldn't do that because of COVID. So we have decided to instead produce a series of presentations with help of Barry Madore, who runs a company called Fire in the Bluff Productions. And he and I have been sitting down digitally, virtually over the last month and recording a whole series of these presentations. There'll be 4 of them in total for this round. And this is the one specifically about the recent archaeological work that we did in Ramsey County, focusing on two different archaeological areas. One is the area around the Gibbs Farm, which is up near Roseville and Falcon Heights and Lauderdale. And the other is the Fish Creek Nature Preserve area, which is in the southern part of Maplewood along the Mississippi River. I'll also be telling some interesting stories about previous archaeological work that were done in both of those locations during the presentation. It is just a recorded one, and it is available on YouTube currently, and it will also be put onto the Maplewood Area Historical Society Collaborative's website and the Ramsey County Historical Society website. But right now it exists on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and you search Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative, just the letters, so MAHSC. If you search those, it'll pop right up as one of the first videos. It'll say archaeology in the title, so you know you're at the right place. And you can take a look at all of the videos as they get done. And we're hoping to do more of these. Barry and I really hit it off, and we enjoyed it quite a bit. So the presentation is 37 minutes long. When that is done, we will open it up for questions. You can ask questions about the presentation itself, but you can also generally ask questions about anything you're interested in archaeology. The farther away you get from St. Paul or Minnesota out into the rest of the world, the less I'm going to know about your question. Also remember, as archaeologists, we don't do dinosaurs, so I can't help you with dinosaur questions or gold questions or where the oil is or anything like that. The Templars, I don't know, buried treasures, I don't know much about those either. So we'll get started here with the presentation. Make sure I'm going to do this correctly. All right, I'm going to share the screen. Here we go.
Welcome to this installment in our series of 4 conversations with archaeologist Jeremy L. Nino. This series is sponsored by the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative and focuses on archaeological work undertaken in 3 of the collaborative's Minnesota counties, Dakota, Ramsey, and Scott. This work was conducted by principal investigator Nino along with his firm, Nino Cultural Consultants. My name is Barry Madore. I had the honor of hosting these conversations with Jeremy. Our first conversation was an overview of the project as a whole. The other 3 focus on the work accomplished in each specific county. Our conversations were held virtually with only our voices being recorded. So what you'll be watching is not so much a video of us talking, but more of a presentation. While we talk, you'll see photos, maps, and documents highlighting both the archaeological work itself and the historical research Nino completed during the project, which began in 2019 and wrapped up in the spring of 2020. Before we begin, you should know that this project was funded in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with a Heritage Partnership Program grant administered by the Minnesota Historical Society and awarded to the Dakota County Historical Society in partnership with the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative. Enjoy the presentation. I'm sitting here with Jeremy Nino of Nino Cultural Consultants. Today's conversation, we're going to be talking about the work specifically done within Ramsey County, which we previewed a bit in the previous conversation. We're going to go a little bit more in depth today. And as Jeremy just let me know, the Ramsey County Historical Society magazine spring 2020 issue has an article that covers some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So you should take a look for that. So Jeremy, we laid out a little bit of an overview of what you've done with the collaborative. Why don't we talk about Ramsey County specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. Although the overall project in its 3rd iteration was primarily focused towards alpha sites, completing archaeological work nearby known sites or sites that had been previously recorded but nothing had been done about them yet. Those are called alpha sites. Each county had a slightly different take on the project. So in Ramsey County, there were 2 areas that we were very interested in doing additional archaeology at. Both of them had had archaeology done in the past and also had the potential for more archaeology to be done nearby them. So they weren't on alpha sites, they were actually on known sites, but we were helping to tidy up some areas that archaeology hadn't been completed in yet and learn a little bit more about how the past played out and worked in those areas. Specifically, in in Ramsey County, the two places that we were looking at were the Gibbs Farm and the Fish Creek Nature Preserve. Gibbs Farm already has an archaeological site number because archaeologists have actually been going out there for a number of different years. It's site 21RA26. Let me talk a little bit about site numbers and how those site numbers get done. Every site that's a recorded known archaeological site in the state of Minnesota has a trinomial system. So the first two numbers are 21. They're always 21. That's Minnesota's magical number within the nationwide archaeology numbering system. So 21 means Minnesota. RA is the county, so Ramsey County. And 26 was the 26th archaeological site in Ramsey County that was recorded with the Office of the State Archaeologist. And this initial work was actually started to get done in the 1990s.
For this site?
Yeah, for this site. So we started recording archaeological sites in the 1960s, but they started doing archaeology at the Gibbs Farm back in 1995. So in the first 30-some years of recording sites, there were only 26 sites in Ramsey County that had been recorded up to that point. So the other day when we were talking in the first presentation, a lot of the near counties within the metro area don't have a lot of archaeological sites in them, and Ramsey County is a great example. It's a small county that was already heavily developed by the time archaeologists started getting organized and doing a lot of their work in the 1960s after the National Historic Preservation Act was passed. So we don't have a lot of archaeological sites in Ramsey County, which is one of the reasons why we keep doing archaeology work here. It's sort of the opposite for as you get farther out of the metro area, we start to see more and more archaeological sites because there's been more and more development that's been happening since the 1960s, right. And that's triggering a lot of archaeological work for us. Let me talk a little bit about the Gibbs family. The Gibbs family purchased the land originally in 1849 for their farmstead. They purchased 150 acres. They actually bought a warrant for land from a gentleman who was a veteran of the Mexican-American War. As payment, being a veteran, he was given a script for 150 acres that he could purchase, and he eventually sold that through a series of people to the Gibbs family, and they came out and used it to purchase land in the newly organized, we're talking brand new, 1849 territory of Minnesota. They had just done a series of treaties with Native peoples to gain access to the land, and then the United States government came out and did early GLO, Government Land Office, surveys in 1849, and then right in that same year, the Gibbs family purchased their property. They had to go out and immediately be on it and be active, and so they built a dugout sod house. They basically dug a big square into the ground and then put a roof over top of that made of sod, and they lived in that for 5 years. Oh, wow. It's just a tiny little house, and they lived in that for 5 years. And then in 1854, they built a log cabin, a one-room log cabin with one room upstairs, and they lived in that for 13 years. Oh, wow. Until their first child was 2 years old, and they're like, "This is crazy. We can't keep living like this. We have to get out of here." So they started adding to their log cabin, and it basically, the house expanded and engulfed that earlier log cabin. And if you go to the Gibbs Farm today, you can actually see where that original log cabin actually sits inside of the house, and today represents a room within it. And then in 1867 they expanded, and then ultimately in 1873 they added another addition to the house. So the 1873 property as it stands today with that farmhouse is significantly different from the 1849 soddy dugout that was there. And that dugout is the very first place where archaeology gets done out at the site. So there's been a series of archaeological investigations, 5 of them that have been completed out at 21RA26. The first one was done by the University of Minnesota way back in 1995. I was only 2 years into my archaeological work at UW-La Crosse when this was being done, so I didn't have anything to do with it back then. But the University of Minnesota investigated the soddy, and they actually dug down to where it had been. You could still see the depression at the time. They dug that out. They found the beams for the laying of the floor. They found lots of artifacts related to it. The dugout had fires during the time, and they had to go and buy new stovepipes and things. And so there's all these great oral traditions and stories from the family that were collected constructed over the years. The last people who lived in the house until the 1940s ultimately gave it to the University of Minnesota, and then it wound its way to the Ramsey County Historical Society. Today, the property has not only the Gibbs Farm itself, but also has a schoolhouse on it. It's got some barns on it. It's got a welcome center, and there is an adjoining, more recent house that's there, a brick house that I think is planning on being demolished, and they're going to be building a much larger multi-use historical venue that's going to be there. And that was one of the reasons why we were doing this additional archaeology for this project. So originally 1995 was the first work, and then 2 years later the Institute for Minnesota Archaeology, or IMA, which used to be a very well-known nonprofit that worked here in the Twin Cities and throughout Minnesota, they came out and did some additional archaeology work on the gardens and things associated with the property. The Gibbs family themselves were considered to be sort of near city suburban gardeners. They would do garden market. That was their primary means of earning money for their farm, and they were pretty good at it too. And they did that all the way up until the 1940s, and then land encroachment was happening and developing, and that was the end of that process. But in 1998, there was additional archaeology. In 1999, there was additional archaeology, and then relatively recently, in 2010, Blondo Consulting came out and did some additional work right around the immediate farmhouse itself and over by where the modern house sits that today is used as some offices for Ramsey County Historical Society and the Gibbs Farm. So there had been a whole series of archaeological digs that had been done. I will say that as one of the things I was able to do as an earlier part of this project from previous years was scan the Gibbs Farm property. So nowadays, since kids who are just getting out of school now, they weren't able to go to the Gibbs Farm this spring because of COVID-19, you can take a virtual tour of the Gibbs farmhouse, and I'm sure we'll create a link here that they'll magically pop up as part of this video, and you can go take a tour of it and a tour of the schoolhouse. There's lots of great links. There's built-in fun little stories and things, and the Gibbs Farm people have been organizing scavenger hunts, virtual scavenger hunts to go look for objects and things that are there. So certainly check that out.
Can you remind us geographically where we're talking about?
So we're talking just north of the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus, up on the border between Falcon Heights and the University of Minnesota St. Paul. Larpenteur Avenue is the main east-west avenue, and then going north-south, it's Cleveland Avenue. So it's the intersection of Cleveland and Larpenteur. It's over by the state fairgrounds, and it's a little island of farm fields surrounded by properties and whatnot. But then there's the big university campus, the St. Paul campus, and then these fields and the golf course. So it's pretty. Yeah, so our work there, we were doing two things. One, we were definitely going out to complete additional archaeological survey in areas that were going to be developed as part of additional future work, find out what had been happening in the past in those property areas. But something that had never been done before for this property, and similarly for Fish Creek, is even though there had been all these different archaeological surveys that had been done in the past, no one had ever consolidated that all into one report. No one ever put them all on the same map or GIS in, or, create a database that has all these things together on it. So our purpose was really twofold. One, to do some archaeology as part of this Alpha Sites project, which worked out really well. And the second one was to really consolidate and summarize all of this work so that the people at Ramsey County could use this as a planning document for whatever future development they were going to use. So it was kind of a twofer in that sense. That's been one of the most successful things in all of these projects across the metro area, and as part of the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative, is almost always, yes, they have an initial purpose that gets done, but there are all these little tie-ins that happen to give extra added benefits, whether it's bringing in a new interest in a small historical society to get involved with doing archaeology, or it's looping in landowners ahead of development that's going to happen, or it's creating a new data set, whether it's artifacts or archaeology that no one's ever been able to do before. So no one's ever taken the time to summarize all these previous archaeological sites into one place. So we did it as part of this project. So our work was really comprised of two transects of shovel tests that were immediately behind the Gibbs farmhouse if you were going off to the north and west of the historic property right before you come to the encroaching golf course. And immediately behind the modern property office house that's there. There used to be a pool in that area by aerial photographs that we saw. So we excavated in a wooded area that's over there with a series of shovel tests, and we found about 200 artifacts. And almost all those artifacts were modern in origin, except for a couple that dated quite nicely from the 1930s and 40s, medicine bottles and other pieces of everyday life that were found. We did a full curation and cataloging of all the diagnostic materials and some of the more interesting, and I know you're going to laugh at this. So we find 198 artifacts as part of this project, right? And we come up with just a small handful, 6 of them to be specific, that were determined to be diagnostic, that were curated for long-term storage at Ramsey County Historical Society. So those 6 objects, and one of them is a brown glass 1-ounce medicine bottle that's very traditional of the kinds of things that people, when they think about archaeology, they're like, oh yes, they found a medicine bottle, really cool. What do you know about that? Oh, we know it's from Whitehall, Tatum and Company's Glassworks of Millville, New Jersey. It was from 1924 to 1938. We know everything we can about this. It's fantastic. And everybody's like, yes, bottles. We know, we love bottles. We also found 2, wait for it, ring pull tab fragments. Very exciting. Everyone's like, what? Yeah, we found these ring pull tabs.
Well, we used to step on the beach all the time.
That's right. So they're actually aluminum pop tabs, are developed in the late 1950s by a guy named E.C. Fraze. And today, and it becomes the dominant way to open up cans. And today, everyone knows exactly what to do with a pop top, and everyone doesn't even give it a second thought. But they have changed, just like when we were talking about before, stylistic changes that happen with projectile points for Native Americans, and they go from really large points to small points, and the types of raw materials changes, and as the technology of what you're doing with that projectile point changes from an atlatl to an arrowhead, it's the exact same thing with pull tabs. They start out looking very one way, and today they look very different. And you might say, well, who cares, right? Why do you guys care about pull tabs that are from the 1970s? Like that nobody cares about that. Well, having been born in 1974 and getting into my mid 40s, the time continues to move forward, and another 40 or 50 years from now, in my own lifetime, when these things are 100 years old, we're going to think of them in the same sexy way that we think about medicine bottles. So there'll be an archaeologist 40 years from now, 50 years from now saying, we found these pop tops from 1970. Can you believe it? Here they are. Now, there'll be a lot more of them on the landscape, but this is of such interest to archaeologists. Not only are we obsessed with things in the far past, but some of us are really obsessed about things in the relatively modern recent times. And there is a movement right now amongst historical archaeologists, those of us that study things in the relatively modern or recent past, to actually catalog and create a huge database of just pull tabs. And because pull tabs are highly diagnostic, they stylistically change over time. Oftentimes they have specific coloring or size or shape differentials from different companies, and you can date a layer of soil pretty fast with a pull tab. We did that exact thing. As a little aside, I was out doing some work at Fort Snelling, and as part of that work, we were shovel testing a whole series of locations, and we found that there was a soil that looked very different from the rest of the soils. And later on, we were told by somebody, oh yes, that soil was brought in, 15 years ago. They put in all this modern fill. It's very recent. Don't worry about it. And as part of our shovel testing, we found a Mountain Dew can with Mountain Dew pull tab on top of it. And we were able to specifically figure out when exactly that soil got put in to within a couple of months.
Oh, wow.
They threw that can away and it ended up in that fill and got the date on the bottom. And because of the very quick serration, the fast time frame, the disposable nature of these things, we were able to figure out, we know exactly when that fill was brought in, and then we were able to use the dates from that artifact to go back to the records and find exactly when they brought in that soil, and they overlapped perfectly. So archaeologists in the future are going to be very excited about the pull tabs that I happen to have saved in 2020 as part of a project. So this is cutting edge stuff. So we did find basically that the area had been a residential family area, a lawn area from, all of the 20th century all up until today. And we didn't find anything really super interesting which would preclude them from being able to build their new development.
Okay.
We're happy that the archaeology has essentially cleared this area so that Ramsey County can go forward and hopefully put together a good proposal to put in a new development there, and archaeology cleared the way for that. So not only did our project help with that project, but we also were able to summarize together all of the different archaeology that happened, and now it's all in one concise document. The site form has been updated for it at the state, so any archaeologist that comes out there and looks at it knows exactly where everyone in the past has dug versus having to go at each of those individual reports, which sometimes reports get lost or they don't get reported and kept. And so we did the work for them. So that was one of the projects. The other project that was in a sort of similar bent was the Fish Creek Archaeological Preserve area. Fish Creek extends through southern Maplewood, and the area is owned by both the city of Maplewood as well as Ramsey County, and it's managed by Ramsey County Parks and Rec. And the area initially was going to be developed as a housing development back in 2005. So a series of developers under the very original name of Carver Crossings of Maplewood were going to be developing a housing development that went from Carver Lake along Fish Creek on these little bluff tops overlooking the creek as it winds its way down to the Mississippi River. So they were going to do this, put on this parcel. It was a 70-acre parcel that was slated for housing development. So they hired an archaeologist to go out there and look for archaeological resources ahead of the development project, which is very common, and that's the business that I'm in, helping developers and historical societies and others know more about the past. So sometimes you're required to do this because you're getting a permit to do work, or you're doing a federal undertaking and you're working for a county or a city. But regardless of the reason for doing it, archaeologists went out from Summit Environmental Solutions in 2005, conducted standard phase 1 archaeological survey over the 70 acres, and they found 2 distinct archaeological sites. One of those just happened to have just one small piece of lithic debris on it, and it's a flake from making or resharpening a stone tool. And the other one, which was located right on the northern edge of Fish Creek, which has cut itself, it has incised itself over time. So it's actually in a really deep cut. And periodically that over the years has flooded dramatically, so much so that the city and county have radically altered the exact creek area itself and channelized it and put it into piping and things. Historically it wasn't like that, but because of modern flooding, they've had a lot of issues. But thousands of years leading up to that, it had incised itself down into a pretty deep, steep valley. So we were just outside that valley. And in 2005, the other archaeologists found a small, basically woodland campsite that's about 500 to 1,500 years old. They had a handful of artifacts that they found, just a couple of pieces of lithic debris and 12 pieces of ceramics. All the lithics were kind of water-worn, and they weren't very sure if they were naturally made or if they were cultural. But the ceramics, the pieces of broken pots that are just made from taking local clays and putting in grit temper into it and then firing it to make a vessel, kind of like what you did when you were in maybe a grade school and you made that ashtray for your parents back in the day. They're doing the exact same techniques. People have been making ceramic pots in Minnesota for 2,000 years. There were 12 pieces of broken ceramic from that, so they found 18 artifacts total, and they said, okay, there's a small archaeological site. It's right on the edge of the boundary area. We don't think it's going to impact your development. We think that the site could be interesting, and maybe you should go back and do some additional work. It could be potentially eligible to the National Register of Historic Places because it goes deeper below the plow zone of the fields that used to be in the area. So think about that. And the developers, I'm sure, were taking that into consideration, but unfortunately, the development went bankrupt and they never completed the project. So when that happened, the county and the city ended up buying the property area and turning it into this park preserve along Fish Creek. And nothing happened for the next 10 years. But then in 2015, as the first round of the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative, this area was investigated again, and this archaeological site, which is 21RA54, is the name of that archaeological site. So let's just do a little bit of perspective things for a second. So in 1995, when the archaeological site was recorded at Gibbs Farm, that was 21RA26. So we fast forward to 2005, 10 years later, and this site is 21RA54. So less than 20 archaeological sites had been identified in the 10 years, 10 years between those two dates. We can actually learn a lot about the history of archaeology in your community just by the pace at which archaeological sites are being recorded. It tells you that there's not a lot of archaeology work that's happening in a place like Ramsey County in the past, and this is a great reason in and of itself to do more archaeology work. I've definitely had some great years in previous projects, like in 2015, doing this work where I think we found almost 10 sites just in 1 year.
Oh, wow.
Doing work in northern Ramsey County around Lake Vadness. But as part of this project, we worked with the Maplewood Area Historical Society, and we worked with the mayor of Maplewood actually came out at the time. We had a nice, great public development project where we had about a dozen people that came out. We did additional shovel tests right where their previous work had been done in 2005 to expand the boundaries, because they were basically right on the property edge for where the development was going to happen. There's a little bit more natural area before the slopes of the creek were naturally formed there. So we got right up to the edge of the slope and we expanded the site boundaries. So we found more of this archaeological woodland campsite. And then we put in some test units, 3 foot by 3 foot square excavations, and slowly dug down an inch at a time, an inch at a time, an inch at a time. It was extreme. I remember it was very hot. I should look back in the records. It was March of 2015 and it was really hot for March. Like super hot. We had a big awning overhead, and we had the camera crews were out there. I was talking to the camera crew. The mayor was there doing some nice photographs and things with me. And over my shoulder, someone yells, "I found a baby's arm!" And everybody, I just like freeze. What? A baby's arm?
The moment.
I'm immediately thinking, okay, it's time to call the sheriff. We got to get the forensic experts out here. And he comes up out of the unit and he brings it over, and it's a little doll's arm, little baby doll's arm.
Relief.
Yeah, that could have been bad. So, we found 68 artifacts as part of our work. 15 of them were for the historic period. One of them was a baby's arm. This is in 2015. In 2015, yes. We found 68 artifacts. 15 of them were historic in nature, but the remaining artifacts, almost 40 of them were more ceramics from the same time period the other one's been found, and 13 additional lithics that were definitely cultural versus natural. We dramatically increased the number of archaeological pieces of material, and we were able to narrow down that time frame for when that site was to the late Woodland, to about 500 years ago. So we learned quite a bit more about this site.
Can you
yes, go ahead.
Remind us of the definition, maybe the etymology of lithic?
Sure. Lithic just means stone. This is stone chipping debris from the production of stone tools.
Okay.
That's one of those problems. Archaeologists, we just throw in all these terms and we're like, what are you talking about? So back in 2015, we found this site and we noticed that this landform type, which is this high bluff that's directly over the cut for Fish Creek, that along Fish Creek as it starts over at Carver Lake and then goes down in a southwestern pattern towards where it dumps out just south of Pig's Eye, the Pig's Eye location or Grand Marais location in the Mississippi River Valley, which, by the way, thousands of years ago before that, 2,000 years before probably when our site was around, there was a burial that was placed there, a mound group. There's one solitary mound that's at the mouth of where Fish Creek, basically where 1061 is right now. And unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. It was demolished during construction. And when the first archaeologists in the 1800s were actually documenting mound groups in Minnesota, they noted that people had already dug into this mound and exposed the human remains, and they were actually looting and looking for objects, unfortunately, with that one mound group. So people have been using Fish Creek for thousands of years as an off-ramp to get up out of the Mississippi River Valley and get to the hinterland areas where the lakes and things are, like Carver Lake. So you can basically use the natural cut for Fish Creek and go up that cut and get up on top of the bluffs.
Okay.
So it's an off-ramp off of the interstate that was the Mississippi River at the time. The rivers crisscross through our state were the highway system of Native peoples in the past. So we noticed that there were a whole series of these similar landforms all along, beginning at Carver Lake and then going down southwest towards the mouth of it at the Mississippi. we had the idea to try to get access to several of these landforms and see, okay, if there's an archaeological site on this one, maybe there are archaeological sites on the other ones. Some of the landforms were in people's backyards, so I did a lot of door knocking and writing letters to people, writing a form letter to them, figuring out who the property owners were and giving them a call and saying, hey, I know this is strange, but I'd like to dig some holes in your backyard. There might be Native American things there. By the way, everyone on this entire part of the project, and really for all the work in Dakota County and the work in Scott County, every time we approached the landowner, and this is oftentimes in the past, archaeologists will say, I had a really hard time getting a hold of the landowner, or I asked to go on the property and they wouldn't let us go on the property, and it just sucks, we couldn't go out and do this work. Every person we asked for this project said yes. Almost every one of them was an enthusiastic yes. Sometimes they were like, tell me more about this. Like, what are you going to do? What do you hope to find? But after explaining to them for just a couple of minutes, people would resoundingly say yes. And then they would even say, come look at this thing I found in the backyard. And they'd bring it out. Or they'd say, I found this really cool, amazing rock when I was on vacation in Mexico. Come take a look at this. And I'd say, great, it's from Mexico. Fantastic. Good for you. One guy had a giant fossil. And he's like, well, you're an archaeologist. Tell me more about this fossil. And I said, it's really old. And it's made out of rock. And I said, I don't know anything about fossils. That's called paleontology. It's a whole number field. Archaeologists, we don't look for gold normally, and we don't dig for dinosaurs. That's kind of the two rules of archaeology right there. Most common misconceptions there. But anybody, not just archaeologists, can tell you about fossils.
So let's get back to what the archaeologists talk about.
Yeah. So we selected 3 different locations. Some of them are on private land, some of them are on public land. We worked with the Ramsey County Parks and Rec Department, who very nice, Kenneth Pelto over there, was very enthusiastic about us going out and doing public archaeology, helped us advertise. Ahead of each of these programs that we did a public talk in the community. And people would be very interested, and they'd like, how can I find out more? And so we had Facebook pages and things about it. And I will say that Bob Jensen from the Maplewood Area Historical Society was the president at the time. He was also a really good volunteer, and to this day continues to volunteer and do work with me in the Fish Creek area all the time. So we went out and we did a whole series of days of digs on these other properties looking for more archaeological sites. And unfortunately, we didn't find any. And what that tells us is that people essentially would use the off-ramp, and they'd get to a certain point as they just come up the valley, and they get to the first spot, and that was the spot they'd like to set up to camp. So it might have taken them quite a bit of time to finally got to this portage point. You take the off-ramp, finally up on top, and you're like, okay, let's set up camp right here. And then they would push on after that. They go all the way to Carver Lake or to wherever else they were going. We didn't find a whole other series of campsites. It's very likely that people came back and they realized that this was a good camping spot and used it time after time after time.
Just reused it, yeah.
Because we find those archaeological sites in that very first spot, and then after that we don't find any other ones. It could be that we just didn't look in the right places. There are 2 sides to the creek. We were looking on the south side. Maybe it was on the north side. We can certainly go back and do some more archaeological work in the future. So that was in the fall, this last fall. Over the wintertime, we got access to a small local collection of materials from the Lido family, who used to live right at the source of where the Fish Creek comes immediately right out of Carver Lake. And as kids, these 2 sisters and a brother, or 2 brothers and a sister, these 3 kids, they would find things in their garden, and then they'd be showed to them by their parents. And they'd say, oh, there's a Native American site there. They found a series of arrowheads and pieces of lithic debris, stone chipping debris from tools. All of them seem to date to the same time period, the early to middle woodland. So they're all about 2,000 years old. They're all similar raw materials. So it seems to be one concise collection. It's not a lot of stuff that's hodgepodge together that they could have found at going to antique stores or on vacation or whatnot. So the story makes a lot of sense. So we documented this collection over the winter, and we then got additional information from Ramsey County Parks and Rec and from one landowner whose land we had to walk across to get to where we did this work. We did another 20 shovel tests during COVID, and I've got a nice picture here of us all standing in front of the cars with our masks on and everything. We did a lot of archaeology is great for social distancing to begin with. We spread out, we're in fields.
It's called archaeological distancing.
Yeah, it's normal. So you usually work in small teams of 2 people. One person's digging, one person's screening. You can be 4, 5, 6 feet apart when you're doing that. They don't touch each other's equipment. Everybody was wearing gloves anyway and whatnot. So we followed all the good CDC guidelines to do this work. We put in 20 shovel tests and we found nothing else. So in all the work that we did for Fish Creek, we did not find any additional archaeological sites, but we were also able to create a data set that includes now all of the archaeology work that's been done along Fish Creek, from that mound group that's way down at the very mouth of the creek all the way up to the lake itself, where any of the known archaeological sites within 2 miles fall on maps. And again, this is a data set that the Ramsey County Parks and Rec can use when they start to put in trails and develop the park itself. Because once areas are cleared of archaeology, then you can put a nice trail on top of it. You don't feel bad about it. We can avoid the place where 21 RA 54 is at, and we pull up an interpretive sign or something and say there's 2,000 years ago, people came and camped right in this spot when they were coming up out of the Mississippi River and walked by exactly the same place that you walked by today. So that all that information comes together and is really helpful to be used. So both these projects were summative and added and pulled together additional information. Yeah, that's the project.
Excellent. So you've hinted a little bit. Are there specific ideas about what to do next in Ramsey County?
Well, I don't think we need to do any additional work at Gibbs Farm. The immediate core itself has been heavily developed by the putting into the intersection for Larpenteur and Cleveland. So we wouldn't do our archaeology right in the ditches or anything like that. Doesn't make any sense. And plus, it's a great place for utilities. People love to put utility corridors there as well. So we don't want to dig up buried utilities. That's a bad idea. But so there is a little bit of property at the Gibbs Farm right where if you've ever been there before, there's a series of pens for the animals and things near the corner of Larpenteur and Cleveland that no archaeologists have ever looked at. And then also there's a paved over parking area in the very northeast corner of the site that no one's looked at archaeologically either because it's underneath pavement. So we could go back and investigate those, but I really think that our work there is done. Fish Creek, there's still acres and acres and acres of prime spots that we could go back to. Bob just emailed me this last week and said, let's go back to Fish Creek. Let's go back and look for some more sites. Now that we've started to create a good relationship with local landowners right around Carver Lake, it would be really interesting on the shores of Carver Lake that have been relatively undeveloped yet. There is a nice county park that's right over there with a swimming area and everything. I'm pretty sure that's been heavily impacted already. But some people's properties go right up to the lake edge. They've been mowed and things. They've been a little bit of landscaping that's been done, but they probably haven't modified that landscape too much. That would be a great place to go back and look. And then we can continue to sort of widen our gaze and look down into the area of Pig's Eye down in the Mississippi corridor as well. One of these days, I know I'm going to get permission or someone's going to come to me and say, we really want to look for Pig's Eye. We want to look for the earliest St. Paul, setup spots. There's a large flat island area down there, which Native Americans call Grand Marais, and we call Pike, the Pig's Eye area. And I would love to do archaeology down in those areas. Well, it's an old residential area that used to be there for a long time, and now it's just sort of industrial scrub brushland area, right. And that would be really exciting to do. And I'm always interested in doing more work around the smaller sets of lakes, like Lake Gervais or Vadness Lake or Snail Lake. I've done archaeology work around those. We've found lots of woodland sites from the last 2,000 years along those. I know if we continue to look at other lakes going steadily north in Ramsey County as development continues to push forward and then push out of the county and go to Forest Lake and places like that, I know we're going to continue to find sites. So I would love to do that work ahead of development, and that may be something that the Ramsey County Historical Society decides to do with its next round. But I think they're pretty preoccupied right now with what's going on with COVID and how to reform a lot of their work, but I know they're going to be really excited and gearing up for this new project out at the Gibbs Farm to build a new development out there.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think that just about wraps things up.
My pleasure. Look forward to doing some more of these.
See you next time.
All right. Take care.
And thank you all for joining us for this conversation with Jeremy L. Nino about the archaeological work Nino Cultural Consultants did in partnership with the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative. You can find the video presentations of our conversations covering the archaeological work done in each of the Collaborative's 3 counties, and one focusing on the overall project, on the websites for each historical society. We hope you take a chance to view them all and participate the next time there's a public archaeology project in your area.
Okay, that was the presentation. I hope that you could hear it. I apologize that I did not, that particular version of the video, I did not have a subtitles on it. However, when you go to the YouTube video presentation, there are subtitles on that, so you can watch it again. I know I talk very fast. We were in a conversational mode. Barry really got me going a little bit. So, you know, I was talking quickly, and there are subtitles that are perfect for it. I've reviewed it with that, and it's great. So, okay, we're starting to get Chuck's talking a little bit. Hi, Chuck. We have some time now for a Q&A. We've got about 15 minutes or so. If you have specific questions about the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative or any of the work that we did in this last 2019-2020, or you have a general question about archaeology just here in the state, you can type it into the Zoom group chat area here. I see that Robin has been very diligently putting in a whole series of links and things. So we're starting to get some questions. I have a question here from David. Do you have any idea of where some of the Selkirk settlements migrants had home sites in the Grand Marais Pig's Eye area? I have not had the opportunity yet to do any research in that Pig's Eye Grand Marais area yet. Unfortunately, with archaeology as a business that I'm in now, I go where people pay me to go, oftentimes, a lot of the time. So where development is happening, that's what's directing my interests. I get really into whatever project I'm doing, and so I don't have specific things on that. Maybe perhaps Bob has some answers about that. He's been interested in doing some research in the Pig's Eye area as well. Bob, do you have an answer for David?
I do. First of all, you really couldn't live on the east side of the Mississippi prior to 1838 because that belonged to the Dakota, but the Dakota signed the treaty, and immediately, in fact, the fall of 1838, some of the fur traders who were associated with Mendota moved in. And I do have a map about 1847 that shows, perhaps 10 families that lived right next to the Mississippi River in what was then called Pig's Eye Island. It's no longer an island, it's like a peninsula. And there is a listing, J. Fletcher Williams had created a listing of the people that live there. So I'm trying to remember, I'm saying there's 10 or 15 of the fur traders. Unfortunately, the Pig's Eye floods out pretty much every spring, or it used to, at least in the early days, and they didn't stay very long. They were followed by settlers, farmers that came in and tried to farm that land.
Okay. So hopefully maybe we'll get a grant at some point, or Bob will magically find a big pot of money for us to go and do some work there. What's interesting, of course, is because of all the flooding that's happened and people got pushed off and then they come back and maybe do some redevelopment in the area, that flood layers are going to have capped some of the previous archaeology. So that archaeology, it might be deeply buried by lots and lots of layers of later on occupation and flooding episodes, but it could still be there. So it's like in a capsule right now. That would be, I would love to go and do that kind of work. Margaret has a question about, is there a map of archaeological places around Vadness? The answer to that is yes and no. There have been some archaeology reports that were done as part of this work early on, and there's an archaeology report that's available through the Office of the State Archaeologist, as well as potentially from the Ramsey County Historical Society, talking about some of the archaeology. I do know that we currently don't have a map that's publicly available that shows where sites are at. I've been trying to work with, there's a series of parks right around in that area. I've been trying to get some interpretive signs and things put up so that people can be made aware of them. We always run this tension between letting people know where archaeological sites are and not letting them know where archaeological sites are, because we're afraid of looting on archaeological sites. However, the sites are immediately adjacent to the water. They're on a couple of different peninsulas that are around both Lake Vadness and also Lake Owasso, Snail Lake, several of the lakes that are there. I do know that the North Owasso Neighborhood Group, NLONG, that's their title, they're actually in the final processes right now of putting up an archaeological interpretive and appreciation sign in the Owasso, Lake Owasso area for our site that we found there back in 2015. Is it common, Kathy has a question, is it common for metropolitan areas to have fewer archaeological projects than suburban or rural areas? Yes. So essentially in urban settings, because the development happened a lot earlier than the 1970s and 60s and 70s, when archaeology as a regulatory investigation process. Basically, there was an act that was passed called the National Historic Preservation Act, and that mandated that if you were getting federal funds to do something with your development project, you had to consider cultural resources the same way you considered natural resources, and you needed to hire an archaeologist. And in those days, most of the archaeologists were working with universities, so you'd have to bring in a university archaeologist out there. Here in Minnesota, our first state archaeologist was a professor at the University of Minnesota, and so the University of Minnesota did a lot of the early work, and then the Minnesota Historical Society, and then the Department of Transportation here in Minnesota, larger institutions, as they got into that. Today, MHS and others don't do a lot of archaeological work. They actually subcontract that work out to people like myself. There are a whole series of smaller archaeological firms that operate in the Twin Cities, and we do those projects. So today, a lot of the development that's the sort of the hotbed for the development that's happening in the metro area is all along the exurb ring. So almost half of all the archaeology that I now do in and around the Twin Cities is actually happening in Suburban County and up on the very fringes, up in places like Becker, Monticello, that northwest corridor. That's more people are moving to that area in the Twin Cities than anywhere else in the Twin Cities. So that ring around the cities is getting a lot of attention. However, there are other times when archaeology does get triggered, oftentimes when there's a known site that gets ran into, or there's a large development, like say they're doing a transportation corridor for a new metro line. You'll have to do archaeology for that. Or there's a new major development for, I don't know, a baseball stadium or thing that's going in, both in Twin Cities, both in Minneapolis and in St. Paul. So you might have people come back and look for archaeology. However, a lot of the archaeology from previous peoples and prehistoric peoples has been disturbed or destroyed in historic settings. So then their focus shifts to historic sites. So when, for example, when the Excel Center was put in, there was a whole series of archaeology that was done by the 106 Group, a large archaeology company based here in the Twin Cities and right in St. Paul. And they did a bunch of archaeology on the city block areas where the Excel Center was going in, and they did some wonderful reporting about downtown urban life in the late 1800s, and it happened to be an area of ill repute down that area, so there's some pretty exciting archaeological finds. So generally today, a lot of archaeology is happening on the fringes of the Twin Cities, but that also means that those places have more archaeological sites that are found. You know, sometimes I get asked the question, are there just more archaeological sites, say, outside Ramsey County than inside of Ramsey County? are there more native peoples that were living in other areas? And my answer to that would be no. The area right along the Mississippi River would have had the highest concentrations of native peoples in the past. The largest villages that we find here in Minnesota, historically, that we first have individuals as Euro-Americans are coming in and running into Native Americans and living with them and trading with them and documenting where they're at. Their large villages are all along the Mississippi River, and they extend from the St. Paul area all the way down to La Crosse, major villages all along the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi was a big area to both travel and to get your resources from. You needed that, so that was a big place to live. All right, next question I have. Sorry if I talk too much. 8 o'clock is just sort of we'll go until we run out of questions for a little while here. Another question I have from Marcia is, how or where do I find information about sites specifically related to Native Americans? Some of the best ways to go about that is to actually talk to the Office of the State Archaeologist, or the Minnesota Historical Society, or the State Historic Preservation Office, or your local county historical society. I've been working closely with lots of local historical societies, helping them to better understand the archaeology in their own backyards. And for each of the Metro Area Historical Society partners, I produced an archaeological understanding document that talks generally about the archaeological information that we currently know about those places, how many sites, what types of sites, and generally where they are on the landscape. You can talk to executive directors or others to get access to those types of reports. You can also, I would say here, you can talk to the amazing people that are associated with the Minnesota Archaeological Society, including some of the people that are on this presentation call tonight. They are board members, specifically Chuck Deason, I can see, is a board member of the Minnesota Archaeological Society. The Minnesota Archaeological Society has been around for almost 100 years now, and they are an avocational group of just individuals that are interested from all walks of life in the archaeology of Minnesota. You can go over to their website. I don't know it off the top of my head, but if you search Minnesota Archaeological Society, you can find, and they also publish the Minnesota Archaeologist, which is the premier publication for archaeological information in the state. You can become a member, and you can, as a member, I'm going to admit somebody that came on a little bit late here. As a member, you can get access to that journal. It's one of the perks of being a member, and find out about the interesting archaeology that's going on, including the most recent volume that's out right now has a lot of stuff about the Fort Snelling excavations that have been going on for decades and decades. Next question comes from Christina. Have you been involved with archaeological work at fur trades related sites? I did not plant Christina in the audience to ask me this question. Christina, I absolutely have been. Luckily for me, I went to UW La Crosse from 1993 to 1997. That's where I got my undergraduate. I was initially interested in medieval archaeology. I was going to be a medieval archaeologist, and I was going to go and I was going to do archaeology in Europe and in Ireland and England, and I was going to find all kinds of cool medieval sites. I got the chance to go to Scotland and spent a wonderful spring there doing archaeology. I worked for the Center for Field Archaeology based out of the University of Edinburgh. I did find some archaeological sites when I was working there, Roman sites, medieval sites. That was great. More importantly, I found my wife. She was also going to school over there, and we've been married now for more than 20 years, which is kind of exciting. But so I was originally going to do medieval archaeology, but then I realized that there weren't a lot of jobs in European archaeology, especially for Americans. So I came back and finished my work at UW La Crosse. And as part of my work at UW La Crosse, I worked on fur trade sites. Specifically, that's what I got interested in historical archaeology. And I specifically worked on sites in the La Crosse area and right in the Trempealeau area. So the specific site that I worked on was 47 TR30. So it's called Perot's Post. It's in Perot State Park. Nicholas Perot is a well-known French fur trader that was in the 1780s, was operating in Wisconsin. and 47 is Wisconsin's number, whereas 21 is Minnesota's. So TR, it's in Trempealeau County. It was the 30th archaeological site that was recorded there, so that's its trinomial designation. And my senior thesis work, I spent 3 summers working there, and my senior thesis work showed that the French fur trade goods that were on that site were from a period after Nicolas Perrot was there. So they've always called that site Perrot's Post, and I showed in my senior thesis work that it wasn't Perrot's Post, that if it was anybody's post, it was actually this later guy named René Linctot, the René Sieur de Linctot. So, of course, I would also say now, looking back at that work, that site was actually much more likely to be a Native American site that had French fur trade goods on it. So yes, I have done some fur trade archaeology. It was my first love and passion in archaeology, and I have a lot of great stories about that. And maybe I'll do a podcast about that at some point. Let's see. The last question I have here is from Robin. You talked a bit about woodland mounds. Do you know how many that still exist, and have they all been investigated? Boy, Robin, that's a loaded question. Thank you. We first started documenting mounds in Minnesota back in the late 1800s. The first, I would say professional archaeology, but they weren't professional archaeologists. They were actually a surveyor and another avocational archaeologist. They were paid by the Minnesota Historical Society by a guy named Winchell. He paid them to go out and start documenting mounds in Minnesota. They documented tens of thousands of mounds, and they published the first major publication for the Minnesota Historical Society called Aborigines of Minnesota. I'm going to tilt my screen a little bit here, and my copy of Aborigines of Minnesota is in this glass case right there in my office. So don't break into my office, but there it is. That's my copy. I don't use that copy because it's worth a lot of money. I actually use another volume. Let's see, I'll just see here. I use another volume about mounds that somebody in my team must have walked off with. They probably have it at their desk right now, but there was a compilation of work that was done by Constance Arzigian and Kathleen, and they published a volume with the state archaeologist, the first state archaeologist publication that had been done about 10 or 15 years ago now, and it is an updated version of the mounds and what we know about those mounds. We stopped excavating mounds in Minnesota in the 1970s, in about 1976. It was common practice in early archaeological work in Minnesota to investigate mounds by digging into them. Over time, archaeologists realized that this not only was offensive to Native American peoples, but it was simply not needed. We have lots of scientific data that we can learn about mounds without excavating mounds. And we now, of course, have federal and state laws that protect mounds. Most importantly, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, but also the Cemeteries Act here in Minnesota. So we do not investigate mounds in the same way anymore. The only times that mound work is still done is when mounds are accidentally disturbed by construction projects, or mound groups are impacted in some way by flooding, or when bridges and other things collapse and flood out. Some more recent examples of that are up in the Duluth area. There was a mound group that was impacted by construction. And then in the Lake Minnetonka area, there's also been a mound group. And when those things happen, by the way, if you ever find human remains when you're out, or you think you find human remains, immediately contact the state archaeologist. If I ever found human remains, I call the state archaeologist, but then my second call is to the sheriff, county sheriff, because it's potentially a crime that's been committed. The state archaeologist works with Hamline University to determine the provenience of those Native American or Euro-American materials, and if it's a crime scene or if it's an archaeological site. But regardless, archaeologists in the whole do not investigate in mound groups anymore. Today, we actually use non-invasive practices for looking at mounds, specifically ground penetrating radar, resistivity, magnetometry, aerial photography, and LIDAR, which is a type of aerial photography. And we use all of those to look beneath the ground, so to speak, like with a radar, to see what's going on without ever putting a hole in the ground. I have no intent to ever disturb any Native American mounds or any cemetery for that reason. And we use ground penetrating radar all the time to look for mound groups, burials, and things like that. Robin has a next question again, and this one's for Bob. Bob, do you want to say a bit about any archaeology associated with the Burntorp farm, or perhaps any archaeology that you've recently been involved with, specifically collections you've been showing off, maybe related to railroad things or anything like that?
Just happen to have a topic on the railroad, yes. First of all, the Burntorp farm was moved in 1999 to another farm site, and in that move, essentially any remains from the original farm site were destroyed. So there's really no archaeology that we've done on the existing Burntorp farm site. Just in the last few days, I've become very involved with the Vento Trail, which is under consideration as a bus rapid transit from essentially from St. Paul as far north as White Bear Lake. And actually, Jeremy, I think did a little bit of archaeological work on it also. There are very few remains from the railroad. This was the Lake Superior, Mississippi Railroad that came through, opened up in 1872. There are some underground things, privies, for instance, that we knew about. And there's a few remains of the old railroad bed going back to 1868. This is all contained in, I think there are 12 reports that have hundreds of pages. The one report alone has 1,100 pages. It's quite amazing what archaeologists can learn from underground details. I do want to make one more comment back on Fish Creek. It's always impressed me on what archaeologists can interpret from the stone chips or from the pottery. First of all, to be able to tell a pottery shard from a stone, that takes a little bit of skill, but also what you can tell from a chip that came off of an arrowhead. And one of the things Jeremy was able to talk to advanced flint knappers, determined that at Fish Creek, they were from resharpening of stone tools, of arrowheads. They were not the original making of the tools. And that led him to believe that this was a temporary campsite occupied just for a short period of time. It was not a seasonal camp. It was not a permanent camp, which I found impressive. And that kind of led to the thought that Fish Creek was just a passageway, an off-ramp, like Jeremy was saying. So the amount of detail that you can get from archaeological studies is quite amazing. I've been involved with quite a few digging up of privies, looking through archaeology reports about mounds that were excavated back in the 1800s. And it's quite amazing to learn about people that no longer exist. There was no written record of them. We have very little knowledge, but yet you can learn a lot about what they ate, where they lived, how they lived, just from the few details that archaeologists can find.
Okay, Robin, do you have some closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Again, we will be putting up the film that Jeremy shared with you on our website, or at least providing some links with on our website and on Facebook, and at least providing some links when that gets uploaded. Watch for some upcoming programs. We'll be having our next program with the Ramsey County Library, the Roseville Library, will be in August. Jane Kennedy will be talking about the immigration of the Connemara Irish, which will be a really interesting talk. So again, I want to thank everybody for coming. Please feel free to email us at membership@rchs.com if you have any further questions, and I can always pass those on to Jeremy. And again, I want to thank Jeremy Nino and Bob Jensen for being here, and a big thank you also to Barry Madore for the wonderful video. So again, thank you all again. Have a great evening. Stay safe and watch for more programs.
Good night.